walk through to walk through 4 centuries and really vividly see through images and text how in America there has been a reproduction of structures and ideologies that have created a whole system of inequality. And I acknowledge that this is American history and that some or many of you do not live in America. And I want to just name that we can't ignore how intimately interconnected we are, regardless of our geographical location on this earth. And that these patterns exist globally in society and political structures. So this timeline was created to commemorate actually the 400th year of the first enslaved Africans arriving to America. And so this was a project created in 2019. And then with the New School and Dr. Angel Acosta, they took this timeline and actually created a framework to work with this in a contemplative manner. And what I mean by a contemplative manner is using mindfulness, right? What some of us might call meditation or mindfulness, to actually deepen our understanding of this history, which is oftentimes very painful, very traumatic. So how do we use a contemplative practice to actually develop a more compassionate society? And it starts with being able to be present, presencing, right? I am present and I am sensing. And that starts with the inner circle of yourself. So throughout this experience, we'll look at the timeline and I'll be guiding us and encouraging us to lean on contemplative practice, to notice and be mindful of how you feel, to notice and be mindful of what comes up for you. Whenever you might feel tension, to breathe through it. So that's the combination. It's a beautiful experience. It has been a combination of both the 400 Years of Inequality Committee and then the work done by my mentor, Dr. Angel Acosta. So with that being said, I'm going to walk us through a short contemplative mindfulness practice. If it works for you to turn off your camera so that you can more fully land in your body and land in the space, I invite you to do that. I'm going to leave my camera on, and then at the end, I'll invite you back to the space and to turn your camera back on. So we'll do this short contemplative practice, and then we'll dive into the timeline. And we'll start simply by just noticing where we are in time and space. Noticing the time of day it is. Noticing the room that you're in. Noticing where you're sitting in that room. And just beginning to orient yourself to this moment. And then begin to feel your legs on the chair. Perhaps feeling your feet on the ground. Maybe feeling your back supported. And just noticing where you make contact with the earth or the surface that you're sitting on. Cultivating your sense of presence. And I invite you to gently close your eyes or just bring your gaze down from the screen, whatever is more comfortable for you. And then gently bringing your attention to your breath. Simply noticing how your breath flows in and out. Notice if you have an urge or a sense that you need to control the breath. And if you do, can you let that urge go? Noticing the in breath, noticing the out breath. Also, notice if your mind begins to wander, or if you feel a sense of urgency to do or think of something else. That's totally okay. Simply just notice. And if you can, bring your attention back to the breath. Acknowledging that this practice of noticing is helping cultivate a sense of presence. Just noticing how the breath feels. And we'll close out this contemplative practice with 3 contemplative breaths together. Breathing in through the nose, filling the lungs all the way down to the belly, and exhaling through the mouth, completely emptying the lungs. Breathing again in through the nose. And with an exhale, allow your shoulders to drop, maybe releasing any tension that might be there. And one more collective breath, breathing in through the nose and releasing with an exhale. Allow your breath to return naturally. And gently notice how the mind or body feels now after having spent a couple minutes in a contemplative practice. And however you feel is fine. Maybe you feel the same. Just simply notice. And when you're ready at your own pace, gently blinking open the eyes. Gently bringing your gaze back to the screen. Allowing yourself to rejoin the group Coming back on camera, if you were on camera. Welcome back, and thank you for allowing me to lead you through that short practice. I want to point out the emphasis of presence. That'll be a theme for today. How present can you be with what is? How present can you be with difficult emotions, maybe difficult conversations? And just noticing how you feel. Giving yourself grace to feel that. And remembering to breathe. And with that in the background, we will dive into the 400 years of inequality timeline. Janie is going to put in the chat the link to open the timeline if you desire on your own. I will be going through it and zooming in for everyone to see. So you can simply just follow along with me on my screen. And if you also want, you can open it on your own screen. So we'll just take a look at the timeline from this view. Noticing some of the images, some of the faces, real people from history. Noticing the red text. All men are created equal. Something that we are still contending with today, it seems. Am I not a sister? Am I not a woman and a sister? So we'll start diving into the beginning of the timeline. Why this timeline was created, I mentioned, was to commemorate 1619, when marking the arrival of the 20 precious Africans brought to Jamestown, sold into bondage. And we sit with this. We take a deep breath. Acknowledging 1622 and 1635, the tensions that come with the attempt to take native land and the violence that erupted. And I acknowledge in this moment that I'm on Lenni Lenape land. So recalling to the land acknowledgement that Jennifer so beautifully created for us. Acknowledging the people that owned this land. We zoom out. And we dive a little bit deeper, taking a deep breath, looking at 1838, acknowledging the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee people were forcefully removed from their land. Thousands of indigenous people subject to extermination. That their sacrifice had given life to the country known as the United States. Sensing anything that is coming up for you, noticing what's coming up in your body, taking a deep breath with that. We zoom out and we acknowledge Frederick Douglass inviting us to acknowledge Black excellence, Black fugitivity. We acknowledge the years of the Civil War, 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation, the attempt to eradicate slavery, the rise of the KKK. We breathe into that those toxic ideologies still exist today. We zoom out and we zoom into 1896. The United States Constitution legalizes segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal, a major ruling that sets much of the table with the issues that we deal with today. Cementing an ecology of inequality. We hold that tenderly and we breathe. Acknowledging 1890, women were given the right to vote. Acknowledging that this system impacts not just Indigenous folks, not just people of color, also women. And we breathe with that as we move into the next 200 years. We take a look at this timeline, noticing the pictures, noticing the faces, noticing the red text. And we zoom into 1917. Acknowledging the 10,000 African Americans who marched down Fifth Avenue to parade against lynching. We acknowledge 1918 and the Spanish flu, and how almost 100 years later, we see similar manifestations with COVID-19. And we look at how history vividly repeats itself. We take a deep breath. Noticing any sensations that are coming up for you. Noticing how you feel as we engage in this history. Acknowledging 1950s, marking many struggles that started the civil rights movement and the attempts to break the back of segregation. We acknowledge 1969 and the Stonewall riots, that this system of inequality impacts LGBTQI folks and trans folks. We breathe into the cataclysmic wars, the 20 years of the Vietnam War, the rise of the LGBTQ movement, the women's movement, bringing us to think of all of the people who are ignored at the margins. We breathe into that. We acknowledge the 80s and the anti-immigrant rhetoric still exists today. The increasing hate crimes against Asian Americans that still exist today. The coalescing of the inequality of all people. We dive into the 90s. We acknowledge the face of Rodney King, one of the first widely publicized recordings of police violence, inciting riots, 3 days of riots. We look at how that still exists today. And we take a deep breath. We acknowledge 9/11, the emergence of the war in the Middle East. And we work with the vulnerability of the nation, of our communities. The rise of school shootings, acknowledging youth not having the tools or the skills to articulate their emotions, to work through trauma, and how that still exists today. And we get closer to current day, acknowledging the Obama era, the Trump era, the movements of Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the face of Trayvon Martin, killed for his skin color as he was buying snacks at a nearby convenience store. We acknowledge Matthew Shepard, murdered for his sexual orientation. We breathe into that. Sensing, noticing whatever's coming up for you. We acknowledge Dylan Roof, whose heart was so full of anger. He killed 9 people, 9 African Americans, and in a church. And the timeline stops at 2017. Acknowledging that's not the end of this history of inequality. As we zoom out, we can sense into these 400 years of both struggle and resilience. And we acknowledge the patterns that repeat themselves. We acknowledge how the patterns are not unique to just the United States of America, but again, exist globally, and point to both our fragility and our interconnection. And we breathe into that. So I invite everyone to, again, take a collective breath together, breathing deeply in through the nose and exhaling and just noticing how that experience was for you. Noticing where you might have felt tension, maybe how you resonated with certain parts on the timeline, or maybe something came up for you that wasn't even on the timeline. And we'll move into another contemplative practice. We'll engage in contemplative journaling for 15 minutes. During this exercise, I encourage you to either write a regular journal entry, a poem, or a letter to someone on the timeline, a letter to an ancestor, or a letter to yourself. The timeline again is in the chat if you want to look through it as you write. I acknowledge that we didn't look at every part on the timeline, and that's okay. You can look at that later. But I really just encourage you in this contemplative practice to write for at least 10 minutes. And we call this writing for full presence. So writing for a straight 10 minutes, whatever is coming to you in the form of your choice of a journal entry, a free write, poem, or letter. And if you want to take the whole 15 minutes to write, that's perfectly fine. We do encourage 10 minutes. And then if you want to take 5 minutes to just sit in silent reflection or maybe get up and stretch, you're welcome to do that as well. But we'll come back together at 10:45.